Hello and welcome to this Christmas special video about the National Health Service. My name is Sam Collins, Senior Advisor to the Director General, and as I said, today we will be discussing the National Health Service. Despite being perennially short of cash and a mid-table performer as far as health outcomes are concerned, best summed up by the now infamous Guardian quote that the NHS was a world leader on everything except keeping people alive, the NHS is still considered to be a third rail of British politics, one where even touching the issue can cause a political or Twitter storm. Someone who knows all about that is my guest today. I'm delighted to be joined by the IEA's Head of Political Economy, Dr. Kristian Niemietz. Look, Kristian, neither of us, as people will be able to tell from our respective accents, are natives of the UK, and both of us come from countries that have a very different view of the healthcare system. That it's a public service that is very little different, that has very little difference to the welfare department or the education department or any other government department. I don't know about you, but when I first arrived in the UK, I remember thinking about how remarkable the British love of the NHS as an institution was. For example, the 2012 Olympic Games opening ceremony, where almost unbelievably, at least to my mind, a large part of it was dedicated to this very beautiful image of the NHS as this caring institution where children are jumping up and down on the beds, which I imagine isn't hugely what they're up to in the NHS itself. I can't imagine this quasi-worship of government departments being the case in any other democratic nation, though. Where does it come from, and what are your views on it?
Yes, you're absolutely right. That was my experience as well. I sort of knew about it before because I had read about it before I moved here, but I thought that was a bit of a cliche and probably only a half truth. But then living here, you quickly notice, no, this is actually completely true. And yes, for me as well, the healthcare system has always been something that is there to serve a specific role, but not something that you have a particular reverence for. It's more like the land valuation office. As long as it does its job, okay, good. But there's no reason why you would dance around it and elevate it in any particular way. But no, it has simply become part of the national story. It has become, I think in a previous paper, I described it as a founding myth, comparable to what Independence Day is for the United States and the Constitution, or what celebrating the anniversary of Bastille Day is in France, celebrating the French Revolution, where you can also say, hang on, is that really the most rational thing to do, given that the French Revolution was actually pretty horrendous and not something that you should celebrate. But sometimes countries just have these stories that they tell themselves about themselves, that can be about a particular founding figure, a historic event, and can be a particular character. I mean, you could say that until a couple of years ago, Winston Churchill had the role of a semi-mythologized figure that if you had criticized him, that would have been a bit of a social taboo. That has now changed. Now it's become almost fashionable to slag off Churchill, but until a couple of years ago, he had that role, and the NHS is very much NHS worship is a bit in that mold. You miss the point if you just see it as a healthcare system, and one should see it as more of a national symbol, a source of national pride. And I have to say, under different circumstances, I would be okay with that. If I lived in France, I would not go around telling people that they shouldn't celebrate the French Revolution, or that it wasn't as great as the celebration suggests. I would say, okay, this is clearly something that creates a certain team spirit, community spirit. This is actually a good thing, even if it isn't historically accurate. I would even, in circumstances like that, I would say that if somebody comes up and says, well, actually, if you look at the history books, I would think that if somebody did that, I would think of that as nitpicking, as pointless pedantry. But I'm afraid when it comes to the NHS, I have to be the nitpicker. I have to be the party pooper who does the nitpicking and who gets on everyone's nerves. But I think there's a good reason for doing that, or at least two good reasons. Firstly, the NHS isn't just a national symbol. It is also at the same time an actual healthcare system. It also does have a role to play in well, curing people and keeping them alive, and it doesn't do that very well. So therefore, I'd say it's dangerous to romanticize the healthcare system in the way that other kinds of national symbol celebrations are harmless. If people want to dance around an Olympics team, that's perfectly fine. If they want to glorify an Olympics team, even if objectively it isn't very good, that's also fine. But why does it have to be a healthcare system? Choose anything other than that. And secondly, I'd say even this communitarian defense of the NHS doesn't really stand up, because it isn't a unifying institution. Quite far from it. It is actually a source of a lot of divisions that you can see this every time that as you've mentioned, somebody says something less than favorable about it, and you get an outbreak of hysteria around that, and you constantly get people accusing their opponents of being somehow enemies of the NHS, and that's not something you would expect from a national from a national institution that's unifying. It's quite the opposite. It's become a very divisive institution.
Yes, I wanted to pick up on that because you're right that people seem to get very angry, especially online, as soon as anybody mentions the National Health Service or saying it's anything other than the envy of the world or perfect, or once you suggest that there could be some very minor reforms that could help improve healthcare outcomes for people in Britain. I mean, I remember, I'm sure you'll forgive me for saying this, you wrote a quite innocuous paper earlier on in the year. I don't think you said anything that anyone would consider to be particularly controversial, at least if it was about any other government department. You were saying, I think you said that the NHS did fine, but not particularly that much better than anybody else, and shouldn't be seen as a world leader, which, to be honest, I think is quite a reasonable thing to say. And I think if you'd said it about how the HMRC had responded to the COVID pandemic, nobody would have batted an eyelid. But the response you got was a Twitter storm, and went all the way up to you being personally insulted, I think, by the deputy leader of the Labour Party, which is, I think, something you should definitely hang your hat on for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. But she did my PR work for me. So.
Exactly.
I'm not complaining.
So why do people get so angry about all this? And why aren't they equally angry? I mean, I guess you kind of explained it a bit about it being a founding myth, but it just seems odd that they don't get equally angry about other elements of government policy.
Yes, it's often about the perceived intentions of the person making that criticism. I mean, that Twitter storm and the Angela Rayner story, that was for me, that was not the first story of its kind. This happens more or less with varying degrees. This happens every time I write something on the subject. There have been predecessors of that. And I remember in one case, it was a paper in which I merely compared outcomes and said, in this area, and that area, the NHS is behind most of its peers. But I didn't actually draw any conclusions from that. I didn't say, therefore, we should have reforms X, Y, and Z, or we should look to systems X, Y, and Z who do it better. I just spelled it out, showed the figures, and that was it. Deliberately didn't spell out any conclusions. I did say, obviously, I have my views on what should follow from that, but that's not the subject of this paper. And nonetheless, it also caused a storm of outrage, especially among doctors in that case. And what I noticed is that even though I didn't say the NHS should be replaced by a market system, they assumed that was my position, and correctly, because that is my position. So it's not even wrong. It's just that's not what I said in this particular paper. But it's just knowing that that would be my conclusion. That alone was enough to create a storm of outrage. And it's not that the most vocal defenders of the system, it's not that they're saying everything is fine. In fact, quite the opposite. That was what I initially assumed, that these people wanted me to say everything is brilliant and that's it. But actually, then I looked up a lot of these activist doctors have their own blogs or other forms of output. They write about the NHS themselves. I looked up some of the writings of some of these people, my assumption was that they would just glorify everything. They would just say everything is brilliant. But in fact, that wasn't at all what they said. They were, in fact, in a sense, more alarmist about the NHS. It's just that in their case, it had a very different focus. They would never say there's anything wrong with the NHS as a system. In their case, the alarmism was all about the government is destroying it, the government is mismanaging it. If you frame it in those terms, then you can say that healthcare outcomes in Britain aren't brilliant. That makes it socially permissible, as long as you make it clear you are not blaming the NHS for anything. You are saying the NHS on its own would be the most brilliant system in the world. It's just because of this context. There's a government that secretly hates the NHS, tries to sabotage it. If you frame it in those terms, then it's not just socially acceptable, but even socially desirable. And so, as I said, some of these people were framing it in those terms. They were more alarmist than I am. They were saying things like, the NHS is on the brink of collapse. It's falling apart. Those are things that I've never said. I never said the NHS is failing catastrophically. I never said it's a catastrophic system. I just said on most measures, it is well below average. It is well below most of its peers. I think the phrase that I've used a couple of times was, on outcomes, it's about on a par with the Czech Republic. Now, in absolute terms, that isn't terrible. If I visited the Czech Republic and I got sick, I wouldn't be terrified of going to a hospital there. It's not that that's a system of Wild West medicine. It's just that you would expect, it's just that the Czech Republic was, until 20, 30 years ago, was a poor country. And you would expect Britain to be well ahead rather than about on a par. And therefore, it's a bit of a sobering finding to find that they are more or less the same healthcare-wise. But that's always what I said. So it's not that you're not allowed to say some things are going badly in healthcare. It's just that that always has to be framed as a defense of the NHS rather than an accusation. You have to say the NHS is under attack, and that's why we have all these bad outcomes.
It's really interesting because that you're saying that people on the left talk about the catastrophic, in fact, by the sound of it, do down the NHS more than anybody on the right does, because actually, and you've sort of already alluded to this, but the NHS isn't actually, I mean, free marketeers do sometimes like to go off a bit on the NHS and talk about it being disastrous and awful, but it's actually it's not nearly the worst healthcare system in the world, is it? It just happens to be mid-table mediocrity. Why do you suppose free marketeers are so willing to exaggerate how bad the NHS is?
I think that comes from a time when that was true. It was, to the extent that we have time series and can go back a couple of decades on outcome measures. In the 90s, that was absolutely true. The NHS was miles behind the healthcare systems of other developed countries. It is still close to the bottom of most league tables on outcome measures. Cancer survival, stroke survival, respiratory illnesses, mortality amenable to healthcare, so avoidable deaths, measures of avoidable deaths, those sorts of measures. There you will always find systems like the Swiss one close to the top, and then you get some systems are all over the place, good on some measures, bad on others, and then you get the ones like the NHS that are always somewhere in the bottom third. So those are the outcomes. Clearly not the worst in the world, but just not what you would expect from a first world country. If I showed you a data plot which showed outcomes for various countries, but without labeling the plots, so that you had to guess which dot represents which country, you would probably often mistake Britain for an Eastern European country, because it would be in that sort of ballpark. Czech Republic, Slovenia, so the more prosperous parts of Eastern Europe. That's roughly where it is. But you would not mistake. You would not confuse Britain with Switzerland if it was a plot that showed health outcomes. That's roughly where we are.
So in that case, I mean, I know you're not a huge football fan, but if we're going to talk about, if we're talking low to mid-table, maybe like a Southampton Football Club is where Britain is at the moment, and you compare it to.
You're probably trying to troll someone here.
Nonsense, not at all. But what would it take to get the UK healthcare system, the National Health Service, into, say, the Champions League places?
Right. I don't think that can be done within the current system. I think as far as reform within the system can be achieved, I think we've gone almost as far as we can go. There was actually a lot, I didn't finish that part. That goes back to your earlier question: why are libertarians sometimes exaggerating how bad it is? That's because it was true for a while that the NHS really was miles behind other systems. Things have actually improved during the Blair years, partly because of higher spending. It was only in the Blair years that Britain caught up with the Western European average on healthcare spending, but also because of market reforms. To the extent that that's possible within a state monopoly system, that has happened. For example, before Blair, you would have had almost no choice of specialists and hospital care. So you would get a referral and you would go wherever your GP tells you to go. And then they did introduce a system where you do get a degree of choice, often boycotted. Often GPs will not tell you about this, but it does exist in principle. You can choose between NHS providers and sometimes willing private providers as well. And they've also introduced a payment system where money follows patients. So that means there is a degree now of competition within the service between the different units within it. Different NHS trusts are now more like self-governing entities, and they do compete with each other up to a point. And that is something that has improved outcomes. So we are still in the bottom third in most league tables, but the distance between where we are and where the average is now shorter than it used to be 20-30 years ago. So it has improved in relative terms, starting from a very low base, but nonetheless some improvement. But then can that be taken much further? I don't see how. I think they tried as good as they can. If we want to be among the best in the world healthcare wise, I think we have to adopt a different kind of system. We have to look at what the ones at the top are doing and have a system of that sort. So a Swiss style system. If you want Swiss style health outcomes, you have to have a Swiss style system.
I'm curious because I remember, and this is going back a bit now, but that I think in one of your first books about the National Health Service, you talked about how you could use the Blair reforms and sort of dial them up to 11, and so just to keep extending them out in order to reform the NHS. So are you saying that you don't think that that's possible anymore, or is that what you mean when you say move to a different system?
Yes, that would be a mechanism of getting there. I would. What I wanted to make clear is that when I say adopt a different healthcare system, that doesn't have to be disruptive. That doesn't mean that you shut down the NHS, that you wake up one morning and there's no health service anymore. And then over the next years, you build a completely different one. It doesn't mean that it will be the equivalent of what happened in Central and Eastern Europe in the early 90s, that one economic system is abolished and a completely new one replaces it. It wouldn't work that way. You would just build the new system out of the old one by saying from now on you will get free choice of health insurers. The NHS organizations at the moment allocate funding within the NHS. They are in effect health insurers. They're not that's not what they're called, but that's what they do. They pool money and allocate it to healthcare providers. That's what health insurers do in a Swiss type system. So I said you could simply convert those entities into actual companies and call them health insurers, but crucially give people choice. You would be able to choose any of those in wherever you live. Any of those would be open to everyone. That would be open to private insurers as well. And you then introduce a competitive market and allow them to work out their own contracts with healthcare providers. And that could then mean that depending on which health insurer you choose, healthcare would be delivered in quite different ways. In the way it does work in the Swiss system or the system of the Netherlands, where you can have some options where you as a patient have a very high degree of choice. You go to whichever healthcare provider you want to, and your insurer just pays without otherwise getting involved. Their role would be a very passive one. They just collect contributions and pay out the payments. And but there are also more integrated models where a health insurer would say, we try to set up an integrated pathway where we connect primary care to specialist and hospital care, and we try to come up with a more integrated model of healthcare delivery where you have less choice as an individual, but it might have other advantages. It might be a more coordinated system, and you can choose between these different models of organizing healthcare. And that would be the kind of system I would want to see.
Going back to the NHS as it is now at the moment, it feels like over the past 18 months, we've seen that the NHS, and you did say that it's not catastrophically bad, but it isn't the best performer in the world. But it does seem that the NHS doesn't cope very well with anything that is outside of its normal parameters. So winter crisis, it seems to have a yearly winter crisis, which I don't know how many times it has to happen to cease being a crisis and becoming just the normal operation of the National Health Service over 3 months during winter. But and as well, I think we've spoken before about the booster program and the difficulties that the NHS has had compared to the separate vaccination body that was set up in order to administer the first round of vaccines. That the booster program has been a lot slower in comparison. So why does the NHS have difficulty coping with crises? And is it a bug of this? Is it a bug? Is it a feature of the system? Is there anything that could be done within the current model?
Well, first of all, on the booster program or the vaccination program more generally, there we have to be fair on that. Britain is actually among the best in the world when it comes to the rollout. Definitely the first time round, and even now. I mean, we now have about a third or just over a third of the population with a booster shot already. That is well ahead of what we see in the EU at the moment. Although that is still an echo of the first wave, the original vaccine rollout program. It's what happened is that there has to be a time lag between when you get your second dose and when you qualify for the third one. It was originally, I think, half a year, and they've now shortened it to, I think it's now 3 months. But that means, of course, that the systems that were fast the first time round are now also the fastest ones now, because they have more people who are eligible already. And therefore, what we see now is more or less an echo of the first round, that you see the same countries that were very fast the first time are very fast again now. Britain is one of them. It's not the only one. Israel is the star performer again. Chile is, I think, somewhere in between them, or about on a par with Israel. So, but in any case, those would be the star performers of the first round of the vaccine. They are now among the best with the booster shot. But credit where it's due. That's something which the NHS has been doing well. Although I'd say partly because it's moved away from its usual way of doing things and was more open to involving others. That in this case, there was no resistance, at least the first time around, to involve pharmacies, to have some high street pharmacies, if they have the capacity to administer the vaccine rollout. And that might be a reason why it's going a bit more slowly this time, that there was actually someone from an industry association of pharmacies that said they actually did volunteer and wanted to be part of that, and only a small proportion of the pharmacies that wanted to enroll in the booster rollout were actually accepted. So now we're going back to the something closer to the usual way of doing business. The NHS trying to keep itself to itself and being hostile to outsiders, and as a result, we're seeing some of the problems that we normally see. But still, on that, this is still relatively good. We've now got up to a fairly high number.
Yeah, I just want to push you a bit on that, because yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, you're right. I should have been a bit more generous to the British vaccination program, which has been very successful. But as I understand it, that's almost entirely because the government appointed people from outside of the NHS to drive the program almost independently of the normal NHS bureaucracy. So does that mean that if the problem is that if we require outside intervention to actually get through emergencies, do we almost need a winter health czar in order to appointed every year to get the NHS up to snuff?
Okay, I don't think what works in the vaccine program would work for other parts of healthcare, because a vaccine program is a very curious type of program. It's the sort of thing where even if you're the most convinced free marketeer, where I think you would expect a government program to do okay, because what government entities can often do successfully is mobilize resources quickly and do repetitive tasks, because that's what the vaccine program is. It's unlike other types of healthcare. Other types of healthcare are more individualized. You have to respond to the patient in front of you, who is unlike the patient you may have been dealing with 10 minutes ago. Each case is different. And in the case of the vaccine program, it's the exact opposite of that. It's a very monotonous kind of task. It's very repetitive. You just have to get lots of needles into lots of arms. It's the sort of thing where I think I wrote about this for the Spectator, saying if the Soviet Union was still around, I would expect them to do well on this, because that's the sort of thing that Soviet type economies were good at. That would be the kind of very easily scalable, repetitive tasks. It would be like conveyor belt production, where you set up a production chain which has one task and it just does that in a very repetitive way. Well, although then again, maybe you could extend that to some other parts of healthcare. That I remember there was an IEA publication on this, I think about 2 years ago, by Nima Sanandaji, Swedish economist. He wrote about cost-cutting innovation in healthcare, and he said almost all of the cost-cutting innovations, the instances where operations that used to be very labor-intensive and expensive to do can now be done at a fraction of the cost, but it's not happening in first world countries. It's happening in emerging economies. That in middle-income countries like China and India, they're setting up highly standardized, could almost call them healthcare factories, where you have people who specialize in one type of procedure and do that again and again and again and again. That can be open heart operations or eye surgery, and rather than having the more generalist approach that we have, they have an extremely high degree of specialization and have people who specialize in one or two specific tasks and repeat it over and over again, and they then just get very good at doing it and very quick. And you have doctors who go through several operations a day, where a Western doctor would do one or two. And but the result of that is that they are similar to Western countries in safety standards, but can do things at a fraction of the cost. And in their case, it's necessity being the mother of invention. They simply don't have the resources to set up a Western type healthcare system. For them, it would be the choice between large numbers of people not getting the procedure at all, or that way of doing things. And so they've gone for that. But whatever the reason, it does show that that even in healthcare, for some procedures, standardization can be the way to go.
It's really interesting. One of the big excuses that defenders of the NHS make about, and you alluded to this earlier about that people who argue that the NHS is the perfect system and it would be fantastic if only it were funded a little more. And I suspect this is almost like the reverse of the free marketeer complaint about the NHS being terrible and awful, and that's insofar as it's more of a reflection of what once was rather than what is now. So I had a quick look at some figures before we came on, and the King's Fund projects that we'll be spending £16 billion in real terms, core NHS spending, more in 2021-22 than in 2018/19. Now that's an 11% increase, and that's before we've even talked about any of the additional money that that was to fund the cost of COVID, the vaccination program, etc. So, is it a problem with funding? Is it a problem with what's the issue here? Do they have a point?
Yes, historically that's been true. As you said, it's that this is a time lag between the argument we're having and the underlying reality. We're still talking about things as they were 10 years ago. Often, historically, it's been true in the 80s and 90s. Britain was clearly behind the Western European average in healthcare spending, and that's I suppose just what you get when you have. It's generally true that tax-funded systems are what Britain in that period was an extreme case, but it's also it also used to be true in several other systems that they were behind more market-oriented systems. That's just what happens when healthcare spending, when the healthcare budget is a political decision. That it competes with lots of other demands, and it just sometimes then comes up short. And it's not. There have been attempts to bring in ring-fenced funding. They're doing it now with the coming this extra social care levy or health and care levy. These are attempts to bring in ring-fenced earmarked funds. It's just that's hard to do in the kind of system that we have, because yes, you can introduce a tax and call it the NHS tax or the health and care tax. You can give it an NHS sounding name, but you just have no way of controlling in practice that money really will go towards healthcare, because ultimately it all goes into the same pot, and then it's a political decision. It can go on whatever politicians say it will be spent on. Of course, the money they will raise from this particular levy, that will go to the NHS, but they can at the same time reduce the general NHS spending. And I think that's the general evidence on earmarked taxes, that you can have taxes that are notionally pegged to a particular spending program, but there's no evidence that once you introduce such a tax, that spending on that program really goes up, because politicians can then just decrease other forms of spending. You can only really do that if the health system really is outside of politics. When you have funding institutions like health insurers that are just separate from the political process, where the money that goes to them really is theirs, and politicians never get their hands on it, where you do know, and it does say on your pay slip, this is the health insurance contribution, it goes to the health insurer, and in that way to the healthcare system. And if politicians wanted to divert it to something else, tough luck, they can't do that. It never goes into their coffers. That would be one reason why in some other types of systems it is easier to raise healthcare spending. Here we have the issue that it's always popular if politicians say we want to spend more money on the NHS, but we don't automatically vote for the party that promises the biggest spending increases, and we don't generally trust politicians to raise, if they want to raise taxes. That's still unpopular. We don't trust them to really put that money into the NHS, and so that's why historically it's been true that that spending here was lower than in other systems. That changed in the Blair years. Blair quite early on started with this pledge, the NHS Plan 2000, where he said within, can't remember how many years, within a short time frame, we want to catch up with the European average, and they did. What happened then was that we had the in the Cameron years, it's the NHS fell somewhat behind again in relative terms, because even though there were no cuts to the NHS budget, the NHS budget is never cut literally, that doesn't happen, but it was increased at a pace that barely kept pace with demand increases. And so those were the Cameron years. That's out of date again. Austerity, the so-called austerity, that's long over anyway. In 2019, maybe that gives us the best idea. 2020 is of course a special case, but in 2019, healthcare spending in Britain was almost identical to the Dutch level. So therefore, if there's no reason there's no reason to expect that the Dutch level is the optimum. Not saying that. It's just that if you say that our system is underfunded, then the Dutch system would also be underfunded. You have to make the same claim for them. But if they can manage with that kind of budget, then why can't we? What's the difference? And then of course the difference is that they have a very different healthcare system. Now, even then, there are some systems that even in 2019 still did spend more. It's even then, the NHS was not a high spender particularly, on a par with the Netherlands, but still a percentage point of GDP or more behind Germany, Switzerland, and Sweden. But then it's those are systems. So certainly the German system, which I know from experience, that's a system which is just vastly more generous. It offers you a lot of things that you wouldn't get here. And for example, people can stay at spa resorts every couple of years, something that here we would think of as wellness, as fitness rather than healthcare, and this would be fully paid by the health insurer. And it's things like that, and some more exotic things where you have Chinese medicine and herbal medicine, all kinds of things that we would think of as wellness products rather than healthcare as such. There you can get them, and the health insurer will pay for it. And well, of course, if you want that kind of standard, then you have to be prepared to pay more for it. That's why I never criticized the NHS for not offering me a free spa resort holiday every 4 or 5 years, with sauna and massage and everything. That would be an unfair criticism. If we want that sort of level, then we have to be prepared to spend more than 11% of GDP on healthcare.
Well, I wonder if that would be worth it. I could do with looking out the window at the cold, miserable December day out there. I think I could do with a spa holiday somewhere.
Yeah, definitely nice to have.
So let's finish off with because you've talked about we've talked a lot about the system, how you would look at eventually moving it to a different system. But according to many of our friends on the left, the NHS has been being privatized for at least, I think, the last 20 years. Why is it that firstly, for a privatization that's been going on for so long, we've done such a terrible job of it, apparently, because the NHS is still overwhelmingly state controlled. Or is there something more to it? Is there actually not the privatization that they think there is going on?
No, that was always a conspiracy theory right from the start. And when there are people, it's astonishing. There are people who have been writing about this for 20 years. I found one author who has been writing about this for about 40 years, or slightly more than 40 years. And it just keeps making the same prediction, just keeps saying over and over again, the NHS is being privatized, it will be gone in a couple of years. And then in a couple of years, the NHS is still there. He just keeps saying it. And so this is a bit like one of those millenarian cults where they say on that date, there's going to be, there will be a flying saucer will land, and they will save the chosen ones, and it will be the end of the world otherwise. And there's all that going on. But what's astonishing is that these are not fringe voices. They they have platforms in national newspapers. So the Guardian, obviously, Guardian's very keen on this. Guardian hosts several of these prophets. And their readers never seem to get bored with it. They never seem to realize, hang on, I've read this before. Why is the NHS still there? So it comes in waves. It's often in the context of some reform that's quite technical, quite boring. Nobody quite knows what's in it, really. You get someone saying, well, it's a Trojan horse for privatization, and then a panic breaks out. We currently have this with the Health and Care Bill, but we've had an almost exact, it's an almost exact repetition of what happened a decade ago with the Health and Social Care Act of 2012, where even before it took effect, it was the BMA, the trade unions, the Guardian, the New Statesman, they were all over it, peddling this idea that this is the Trojan horse, this is the privatization bill. And there was an Owen Jones article from, I think, 2012, where he said, rest in peace, NHS, diagnosis, murdered by Tory ideologues. And and of course, you always get these outbreaks, these moral panics, and then after a couple of years, it starts to die down, because well, the reform has passed and it's now part of the new normal. But you never get a soul searching. You never get people saying, okay, I was a bit, I was clearly over egging that pudding a bit. It hasn't happened. But by the time it becomes clear that this latest Trojan horse was no such thing, there's already a new moral panic in town. By then, they will already have jumped to, have latched onto a new course and say, forget everything we said earlier. This is the Trojan horse. This is it now. This is really the final step towards privatization. But this has really been going on since at least 1980.
I mean, I think I remember. Yes, I think I remember a pub quiz or something I did once where somebody read out a quote from saying, and I'm paraphrasing, this is the Conservatives, should they get into government, will destroy the National Health Service and return to a system where only the rich can afford healthcare. And I think the answer was from a Labour manifesto, something like 1955 or So it seems like as long as the NHS has been around, there's been people saying that the next election will see the end of it. So that's very interesting. Thank you very much, Kristian. I really appreciate you taking some time out to talk to us about the National Health Service. And for everybody who's still watching at this point, please make sure that you like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Hit the bell button so that you are made aware of any new videos we put up. And if you have a particular interest in supporting our digital content, the IEA has a Patreon page. Go online, become one of our patrons. Very small amount every month, and hopefully it will help us provide more fantastic videos, as good or even better, if possible, than this one next year. Thank you very much. Goodbye.